In the years when America was deeply divided by laws and customs that treated people unequally, African Americans sought something greater than survival. They sought dignity, safety, and the chance to thrive. Out of that struggle came towns that were not merely places to live, but symbols of hope and resilience. These were communities built from the ground up by families who had been denied opportunity elsewhere. Here, they could create businesses, own property, send their children to school, and worship freely. These towns became sanctuaries where people supported one another and proved, against the odds, that prosperity was possible. Picture a quiet morning in one of these places. The sound of church bells carries over the fields, children run down dirt roads on their way to school, and shopkeepers open their stores along the main street. Neighbors greet each other warmly, proud of what they have built together. These towns were living proof that community spirit, hard work, and determination could carve out safe havens even in the harshest of times. They were not only places on a map, they were dreams made real. But history has a way of testing dreams. These towns did not appear in the headlines of the day, and in many cases, they were deliberately left out of the story of America's progress. Some were wiped away by the stroke of a government pen, others by the shadow of new development projects, and still others through violence and intimidation. What remains today are fragments, scattered documents, fading photographs, and stories passed down through families who remember what was lost. In this video, we are going to journey back into that hidden past. We'll explore the remarkable rise of these self-sufficient black communities, the challenges they faced, and the forces that tried to erase them. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a story about resilience, about the power of memory, and about why remembering matters now more than ever. Because when communities vanish, it's not only homes that are taken away, but also the legacy of generations who dreamed of a better future. As we uncover these untold stories, I invite you to reflect on the meaning of community, justice, and perseverance. And if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, shared, and honored, then please take a moment to support this channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the upcoming chapters in this journey. Every click helps us shine a light on the parts of history that were meant to stay hidden. Together, we can bring these forgotten towns back into the conversation and ensure their legacies live on. So let's begin, by walking the streets of towns that no longer appear on maps, yet still echo with the voices of those who built them. Their stories are waiting to be told. In the early 19th century, as New York City's skyline was only beginning to rise, a quiet village stretched across the upper reaches of Manhattan. It was not marked by grandeur or monumental buildings, but by something far more meaningful, a sense of belonging. Families tended to small gardens, children walked to school carrying slates under their arms, and the sound of hymns rose each Sunday from modest wooden churches. This place, founded in 1825, was more than a cluster of homes. It was a refuge. The residents were people who had faced barriers elsewhere, men and women who longed for a corner of the city where they could live with dignity and stability. On plots of land they worked tirelessly to purchase, they built sturdy houses with porches that looked out over the rolling fields. A community spirit thrived here. Neighbors shared tools, celebrated weddings, and mourned losses together. They dreamed not only of surviving, but of laying down roots that could last for generations. Schools sprang up to serve the children of the village. Inside simple classrooms, teachers guided their students through lessons that promised possibilities far beyond the village borders. Reading, arithmetic, and writing became tools of empowerment. To learn in such an environment was an act of hope, a quiet declaration that their children's futures would not be confined by the limits the wider world sought to impose. 3 churches formed the spiritual heart of the community. Their steeples were not tall, but their presence anchored the village. Within their walls, voices blended in song, prayers were spoken aloud, and the words of Scripture offered comfort. Faith intertwined with determination, creating a moral foundation that carried families through hardship. For the people of this village, spirituality was not only about worship, it was about resilience. What made the community remarkable was not wealth or prestige, but ownership. In a time when property ownership was out of reach for many, residents here proudly held deeds to their land. This ownership was more than a financial transaction, it was proof of self-reliance, a shield against the instability that so often plagued those who were denied the right to settle freely. To walk through the streets of the village was to see pride in every garden, every storefront, and every carefully painted fence. And yet, even as this neighborhood thrived, forces beyond its borders began to close in. The city was expanding. Wealthy planners and politicians, envisioning a vast public park for the elite to stroll and gather, set their sights on the very land where this community had flourished for decades. To them, the village was not a symbol of determination, it was an obstacle. In the mid-1850s, decisions were made in government halls that sealed the community's fate. With a stroke of legal authority, the land was claimed for the creation of what would one day be known as Central Park. Families who had saved for years to buy their homes were told to leave. Churches that had been spiritual lifelines were shuttered. The schoolhouse that had echoed with children's laughter fell silent. For the residents, the loss was more than physical. It was the unraveling of a dream carefully woven across 30 years. Imagine the heartbreak of parents who watched their homes dismantled, or of elders who had hoped to pass on their land to future generations. The displacement fractured a community that had built itself brick by brick, lesson by lesson, hymn by hymn. By 1857, the village no longer existed. In its place stretched the beginnings of Central Park, a landscape designed for leisure and beauty. Visitors would later marvel at its lakes, meadows, and winding paths. Few paused to consider what had been erased beneath the grass and stone. The park became a symbol of progress, while the story of the village faded into obscurity. But memory has a way of enduring. Though the buildings were gone, descendants carried the story forward. Over a century later, researchers and activists pieced together fragments, maps, property records, church documents, to restore the memory of what once stood. In 2001, a small plaque was placed near the site, acknowledging the community that had been lost. It was a modest marker for a place that had once thrived with life, but it served as a reminder that history cannot be buried forever. The story of this vanished neighborhood is not simply about loss. It is also about what people can achieve even when the odds are against them. It is about the courage to create spaces of safety, education, and faith in a time when none of those were guaranteed. And it is about the importance of remembering, because every city park, every monument, every open field may rest on layers of history we cannot see unless we choose to look. As we reflect on this village's rise and fall, we are invited to ask ourselves, what stories lie hidden beneath the ground we walk on each day? Whose voices have been silenced, and what do we owe them now? By honoring their memory, we honor resilience itself. And perhaps, in telling their story, we keep alive the spirit of those who once believed in the power of community against all odds. In the years after the Civil War, when freedom was still fragile and uncertain, a man named John Benson began to dream. Born into bondage, he had known a life where choices were few and opportunities almost non-existent. But when freedom came, Benson turned his vision towards something larger than himself. He imagined a place where families like his could stand on their own, where children could be educated, and where a thriving community could grow from the soil of hardship. With determination as his guide, he carved out such a place in Alabama. On land that he worked tirelessly to secure, Benson built a settlement that was more than just homes, it was a foundation for hope. Families followed, building houses with porches that faced dusty roads, planting gardens that would feed generations, and opening doors to possibility. This settlement became a symbol of what was possible when courage and vision combined. Education quickly became central to the life of the town. A schoolhouse rose from the ground, simple in design but profound in purpose. Inside, children sat on wooden benches, their eyes wide as teachers traced letters on chalkboards. For them, learning was not just about reading and writing, it was about claiming a future their parents had once been denied. The school became a beacon, drawing families closer and binding the community together with the promise of progress. Alongside the school, businesses began to flourish. Small shops sold goods to neighbors, farmers brought produce from nearby fields, and skilled tradesmen offered their work. Each enterprise represented independence, a way of life that defied the limitations once imposed on them. On Saturday mornings, the main street buzzed with activity, voices calling out greetings, laughter spilling from storefronts, and the hum of commerce weaving through the air. Churches, too, stood at the heart of the settlement. Here, faith and fellowship intertwined. The pews were filled with families who sang with conviction, who prayed for strength, and who found in their worship the courage to keep building. Weddings, baptisms, and community gatherings unfolded beneath the church roof, making it a cornerstone of both spiritual and social life. The settlement carried the name of its founder, Benson, and for decades it thrived. It was not simply a village on a map, it was a living testament to what formerly enslaved people could create when given the chance. Every home, every classroom, every business spoke of resilience. Generations grew up knowing that their lives were shaped by John Benson's determination to claim a future that others had once said was impossible. But by the middle of the 20th century, a new force began to reshape the land, not one of human will, but of development. Plans were drawn for a massive dam project that would harness the waters of the Tallapoosa River. Engineers spoke of electricity, of modern progress, and of the economic growth that such a project would bring. Yet in the path of this vision lay the settlement that Benson had built. Families received word that the land they had called home for nearly a century would soon be underwater. For some, the news was incomprehensible. How could a place so full of life simply vanish? Generations had been born there, memories rooted deep in the soil. But progress, as it was defined at the time, left little room for sentiment. One by one, families packed their belongings, carrying with them photographs, heirlooms, and the intangible weight of memory. The schoolhouse, once alive with children's voices, fell silent. The businesses that had been the backbone of independence closed their doors. The churches, which had anchored the community for so long, stood empty. When the dam was completed in the 1960s, the waters began to rise. Slowly, acre by acre, the settlement disappeared beneath the surface. Where once there had been laughter, prayer, and the hum of daily life, there was now only still water. Benson's dream lay submerged, hidden from view but not from memory. Today, Lake Martin stretches wide and serene, a place of recreation and scenic beauty. Few who boat across its waters realize what rests below, the foundations of homes, the outlines of streets, the remnants of a community that once thrived. Beneath the surface lies a history that was never erased, only concealed. Yet memory is resilient, much like the man who first gave the settlement life. John Benson's legacy endures in the stories passed down through descendants and in the determination of those who refuse to let the past be forgotten. The water may cover the land, but it cannot drown the spirit of a community that once turned hardship into hope. To remember Benson's settlement is to honor not only its founder but also the countless men and women who built lives of dignity in a world that often denied them that right. Their story reminds us that progress is not just measured by dams or power lines, but by the preservation of human legacy. Even under the waters of Lake Martin, the echo of that legacy remains, waiting to be heard. In the rolling hills of northern Georgia, there once stood a farming community unlike any other. Built by the hard work of black families, it was a place where the land yielded more than crops, it yielded independence. Families tilled the soil, harvested corn and cotton, raised livestock, and passed down the knowledge of farming from one generation to the next. The air was filled with the scent of earth after rain, the sound of church choirs on Sundays, and the laughter of children playing beneath wide oak trees. This community was more than homes scattered across farmland, it was a promise fulfilled. At a time when the world beyond its borders often sought to limit opportunity, here people built a future with their own hands. They owned their land, raised their children with pride, and invested in schools and churches that strengthened the bonds of community. To outsiders, it may have seemed like just another patch of farmland, but to the families who lived there, it was freedom made real. Yet prosperity in this period was fragile, and peace could be broken by forces beyond the control of those who lived there. In 1912, tension and hostility from the surrounding area erupted into something far darker. Whispers of fear spread through the fields and into the homes. Families who had once greeted one another at sunrise now looked over their shoulders, sensing danger approaching. The violence, when it came, was swift and merciless. Neighbors who had worked the land for decades found themselves driven out by fear and intimidation. Families left behind homes, crops, and churches they had built with their own hands, forced to abandon the fruits of years of labor. Those who had carved out independence from the soil were uprooted, scattered, and silenced. In the aftermath, the once thriving settlement lay empty. The schoolhouse where children once traced their first letters stood quiet. Fields that had provided sustenance grew wild, overtaken by weeds. The roads that once echoed with wagon wheels and church songs became pathways to nowhere. A community that had worked tirelessly to create stability was erased, not by the forces of nature, but by human hands. Decades later, another transformation came. In the 1950s, the government announced plans for a vast reservoir, one that would bring electricity, water, and economic development to the region. Lake Lanier, they said, would become a symbol of progress. And so the waters began to rise, filling valleys and covering farmland. Beneath the growing lake lay the remnants of homes, barns, and fields, physical traces of lives that had already been displaced long before the first drop of water touched the soil. As the reservoir expanded, it submerged what was left of the farming community. Foundations of houses, fence lines, and the outlines of roads vanished beneath the waves. Where once there had been church bells and harvest celebrations, there was now only the quiet lapping of water against the shore. A place that had once embodied resilience and hope now lay hidden beneath the surface, unseen but not entirely forgotten. Today, Lake Lanier is known as a hub of recreation, its blue waters drawing millions each year. Visitors boat, swim, and fish, often unaware of what lies beneath. Few realize that the lake conceals the history of a displaced people, a story buried along with the farmland and homesteads. The surface reflects the sky, but the depths hold memories of families who once built lives along its shores. The story of that lost community is more than a footnote in history, it is a reminder. It reminds us of the fragility of progress when confronted with injustice. It reminds us that prosperity, no matter how hard-earned, can be undone not only by time but by deliberate acts meant to erase it. And it reminds us of the resilience of memory, for even when homes are submerged and fields are gone, the stories of those who built them endure. To speak of that community today is to honor their work, their faith, and their determination. It is to acknowledge what was taken and to ensure that silence does not become the final word. Beneath Lake Lanier lies not just water but history, an echo of a people who once turned farmland into a vision of independence. Though the waves cover their legacy, the memory of their lives and labor continues to rise, insisting on being remembered. During the 1940s, as the Second World War reshaped nations and redefined economies, a city rose almost overnight to meet the demands of a country at war. Built with urgency and purpose, it became a place where thousands of workers, many of them black men and women, found steady jobs, steady pay, and a place to belong. Rows of modest houses stretched across the landscape, their porches filled with families enjoying evening air after long shifts. Streets bustled with children on bicycles, the sound of radios playing swing music, and neighbors gathering to share stories. It was more than temporary housing, it was a thriving community where families could imagine a brighter future. The city was born from necessity. America's factories needed hands, and the call went out across the country. Men and women traveled long distances, leaving behind small towns and rural farms, hoping for opportunity. What they discovered was a city built for them, filled with houses, schools, shops, and playgrounds. For black workers, especially, it represented something rare, a chance to earn a stable living and provide for their families during a time when opportunities elsewhere were few and doors were often closed. Life here carried a rhythm of hope. Mornings began with the rush of workers heading to factories that supplied the war effort, lunchboxes in hand, determination on their faces. Afternoons belonged to families, mothers hanging laundry in neat rows, children chasing each other through open lots, and elders sitting on porches sharing wisdom. On Sundays, churches filled with song, voices lifting not just in prayer but in gratitude for a place where community spirit thrived. Though modest in design, the homes were filled with pride. Every brick and board carried the weight of dreams for stability and belonging. But nature has a way of testing what humans build. In 1948, heavy rains swelled rivers and pushed against the city's defenses. At first, it was just puddles on the streets, then water creeping into yards. Families tried to remain calm, moving belongings to higher shelves, reassuring their children that it was just a passing storm. Yet the rains did not stop. Day by day, the water rose, creeping into homes, drowning roads, and cutting off escape routes. What began as a nuisance soon turned into a catastrophe. The floodwaters poured through the city with a force that no one could withstand. Houses that once echoed with laughter stood knee-deep in water. Streets became rivers, and families clung to what they could carry as they fled. Neighbors helped one another onto boats or makeshift rafts, desperate to reach safety. The city that had been built as a symbol of resilience and wartime determination was now submerged in chaos. When the waters finally receded, the devastation was complete. The city was unrecognizable. Homes were destroyed, belongings scattered, and the spirit of security that once defined the place was shattered. More than 18,000 families, many of them black, were left without shelter, forced to scatter and rebuild their lives elsewhere. Some sought refuge with relatives in distant towns, while others crowded into emergency housing, unsure of what the future would hold. For those who had called this city home, the loss was more than physical. It was the loss of a shared identity, of a place where hard work had created stability in uncertain times. The flood did not only take walls and roofs, it uprooted dreams. Children who had played on the streets of that wartime community would grow up telling stories of the flood that ended their childhood home, their memories preserved like snapshots in time. In the years that followed, the city faded from maps and headlines. Its residents dispersed, its houses gone, its story nearly erased. But beneath the silence lies the memory of a community that mattered. It was a place that gave dignity to thousands, that showed what could be built when opportunity and determination came together, and that proved even in a time of war, people longed for more than survival, they longed for belonging. Today, remembering that city is more than recalling a flood. It is about honoring the families who once lived there, who worked, worshipped, and dreamed in the shadow of wartime industry. It is about recognizing the fragility of progress and the strength of community spirit. And it is about ensuring that even when water washes away streets and homes, it cannot wash away the legacy of the people who built their lives there. That World War II-era city may no longer stand, but the story of its rise and fall remains a testament to resilience. Though the floodwaters carried away the buildings, the memory of the families who once called it home continues to rise, carried forward by those who refuse to let history forget. In the rolling countryside of Alabama, where fertile fields once stretched as far as the eye could see, there stood a town that defied the odds. It was not a sleepy crossroads or a forgotten village, it was a place alive with ambition. Families tilled the land, merchants opened their doors each morning, and the hum of mills echoed across the valley. This was a community where farming and mining together built prosperity, where men and women carved out lives of dignity and self-reliance. At its heart were banks that safeguarded savings, shops that lined bustling streets, and schools where children carried the hopes of a brighter tomorrow. Life here carried the steady rhythm of purpose. At dawn, farmers walked to their fields, the scent of fresh earth rising as plows cut through rich soil. Miners descended into the depths, their work fueling the growing industries of the South. By midday, wagons rolled into town, bringing produce, coal, and cotton to be sold or traded. The clang of blacksmiths' hammers mixed with the chatter of children darting between storefronts. Saturdays brought markets alive with conversation, laughter, and the sweet aroma of homemade pies cooling on wooden counters. The community was more than its economy, it was its people. Neighbors gathered at churches that rang with hymns, while schools stood as beacons of hope, where young minds learned to read, write, and dream beyond the horizon. Families invested in their homes and futures, confident that this town was not just a stopping point, but a foundation upon which generations could stand. Pride ran deep, built not on wealth alone but on the shared sense of belonging that stitched every street and household together. Yet, beneath the promise of growth, a different future was already being written. Plans were drawn for a massive dam project that would forever alter the landscape. Engineers and officials spoke of progress, electricity, industry, and modern convenience. But progress, in this case, came at a steep cost. For the town, progress meant erasure. The fields, the mills, the homes, and the very heart of the community lay in the path of rising waters. When the announcement came, it struck like a thunderclap. Families who had poured their lives into the soil and the streets suddenly faced an impossible truth: their homes would be gone, their businesses dismantled, their history drowned beneath the currents of a man-made lake. Some resisted, clinging to the hope that plans might change. Others began the painful process of packing belongings, selling land, and saying goodbye to neighbors they had known all their lives. The departure was not just physical, it was emotional. Imagine walking down the main street one last time, past the bank where savings had been kept safe, past the mill where fathers and sons had labored, past the schoolhouse where generations had learned their first letters. Each building carried stories, each corner echoed with memory. To leave was not simply to move, it was to sever ties with a place that had nurtured identity and pride. Then came the waters. As the dam was completed and the river swelled, the valley slowly disappeared. First the fields, then the homes, then the very streets where life had once flourished vanished beneath the rising tide. What had once been fertile farmland and a bustling town became the bed of a vast reservoir, its rooftops and foundations buried under waves. The sound of church bells, once carried across the hills, was silenced by the rush of water filling every hollow and ridge. For those who had lived there, the loss was immeasurable. They carried with them not only photographs and heirlooms but also the weight of memory. Stories of the town were passed down like heirlooms themselves, of mills that turned day and night, of banks that helped families build futures, of children who played along dusty roads now submerged forever. What was once a place of prosperity became a ghost beneath the surface, invisible but never forgotten. Today, visitors to Lake Martin see sparkling waters, boats drifting lazily across the waves, and vacationers enjoying its scenic beauty. Few realize that beneath the lake lies the skeleton of a town that once thrived. Few know of the families who worked its fields and mines, who built its banks and schools, who filled its churches with song. Beneath the surface rests an entire way of life, sealed away by the march of progress. Yet, the story of that town does not end with its submersion. Its legacy survives in the resilience of its people, in the determination carried by descendants who remember where their roots lie. Though the water may cover the streets and buildings, it cannot drown the spirit of a community that once stood tall, proud, and prosperous. The town may be hidden, but its story continues to rise, told in whispers, remembered in family gatherings, and honored by those who refuse to let it fade into silence. In the heart of South Carolina, where dense pine forests once stretched endlessly toward the horizon, there rose a town built from timber and dreams. It was a lumber settlement born in the late 1800s, when the nation's appetite for wood seemed insatiable. Towering trees fell one after another, the echo of axes and the shriek of saws filling the air. From the forest's bounty came prosperity, and from prosperity came a thriving community. The town had grown around the mill, as if the great saws at its center were the heartbeat of the place. Families built their homes from the very wood harvested in the forests. Neatly framed houses lined the dirt streets, with smoke rising from chimneys as suppers cooked after long days of labor. The company store bustled with trade, supplying everything from nails and boots to flour and sugar. Schools rang with the sound of children's voices, while churches stood as pillars of faith and fellowship. Though the town owed its existence to industry, it was the people who gave it life. Every morning, the rhythm of work began before the sun climbed fully into the sky. Lumberjacks ventured deep into the woods, their strong backs and calloused hands turning raw wilderness into neatly stacked logs. At the mill, the machinery roared with energy, planks and beams emerging in endless supply to feed a country in the midst of expansion. The wealth generated here didn't belong to just one company, it seeped into every corner of the settlement. Farmers brought produce to trade, blacksmiths kept tools sharp, and merchants prospered as money changed hands. But what set the town apart was not only its industry, it was its unity. Neighbors looked out for one another, children roamed freely between yards, and gatherings in the churchyard became occasions of joy and celebration. Weddings, harvest festivals, and Sunday services gave rhythm to the community beyond the hum of machinery. It was a place where hard work and hope intertwined, where families dared to imagine futures brighter than the shadows of the pines. Still, beneath the success, the fate of the town was tied to one fragile thread, the mill itself. It was the reason the community had sprung up, and without it, everything stood on uncertain ground. As the years passed and the forests thinned, production slowed. The once mighty hum of saws grew quieter, and worry began to ripple through the settlement. Families wondered how long the prosperity could last when the trees that built the town were vanishing. The inevitable came when the mill closed its doors. With no lumber to cut and no work to be had, the town's lifeline was severed. One by one, families packed their belongings, some leaving with heavy hearts to seek opportunities elsewhere, others holding on until the very end. Storefronts that had once bustled with business stood empty, their windows collecting dust. Streets that had echoed with the laughter of children fell silent. By the 1930s, the once thriving lumber town had become a ghost of itself, its identity fading as quickly as the smoke that used to rise from its chimneys. And then came another transformation, one that would bury the town forever. The government, seeking to harness the power of rivers for electricity and flood control, launched massive dam projects across the South. Among them was Lake Marion, a sprawling body of water destined to cover thousands of acres. The abandoned lumber settlement lay directly in its path. When the waters began to rise, the town disappeared piece by piece. Fields turned to marsh, then to shallow pools, and finally to deep water. The outlines of streets vanished beneath rippling waves, homes submerged until only rooftops peeked above the surface before sinking altogether. The church steeple, once a guiding landmark for miles around, slipped silently below, taking with it decades of prayers, hymns, and hopes. What had been a place of labor, family, and faith was erased from the landscape, transformed into the bed of a man-made lake. Fishermen would later cast their lines where children once played, and boats would glide over waters that hid beneath them the remains of sawdust-strewn yards and mill foundations. To visitors today, Lake Marion is a place of recreation and natural beauty. But few realize that beneath its calm surface rests the memory of a bustling town, born of industry and swallowed by progress. Yet, though its buildings lie buried, the story of the lumber town lives on. It endures in the memories of descendants who recall tales of grandparents working in the mill, of families gathered around wood stoves in winter, of communities bound by the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sound of saws echoing through the forest. It remains in the history of the region, a reminder of both the promise and the impermanence of human endeavor. The town may be gone from sight, but its spirit has not been erased. Its legacy whispers through the waters of Lake Marion, calling us to remember that behind every modern landscape lies a hidden past, and beneath every wave may rest the story of a community that once dared to thrive. Across the landscape of America, there once stood towns filled with ambition, culture, and promise. They were not accidents of geography, but deliberate creations, built by people who longed for security, dignity, and a chance to thrive. Families planted roots, businesses opened their doors, schools prepared the next generation, and churches echoed with the sound of voices raised in song. These communities stood as living proof that determination and unity could carve out spaces of hope, even in times of deep hardship. And yet, many of these places no longer appear on maps. They were not forgotten because they failed. They did not vanish due to neglect or mismanagement. Instead, their erasure was the result of powerful forces, decisions made in distant offices, policies written on official paper, or violence unleashed in the dead of night. Some towns fell to eminent domain, their homes and streets claimed for projects deemed more valuable than the lives rooted there. Others were destroyed by coordinated attacks meant to drive families away, leaving ashes where prosperity once stood. Still more were drowned beneath man-made lakes, their histories swallowed by rising waters as dams were built in the name of progress. To walk through these stories is to hear echoes of resilience alongside the silence of loss. Imagine a thriving farming settlement, where neighbors gathered during harvest to celebrate the fruits of their labor. Within a generation, that same settlement was bulldozed, its land seized for a new highway that cut directly through its heart. Families received pennies on the dollar for homes that had taken decades to build. What had once been fields of crops and laughter became stretches of asphalt, carrying travelers who would never know what stood there before. Picture another town, this one rich with shops, theaters, and schools, an entire ecosystem of black entrepreneurship and pride. For years, it thrived despite the barriers surrounding it. But success came with a cost. One night, fear and hatred descended, turning prosperity into rubble. Businesses burned, families fled, and the story of that town was deliberately buried. Its destruction was not a random act, it was a message, a way of asserting control through devastation. Then there are the towns that rest at the bottom of shimmering lakes. At first glance, these bodies of water appear serene, places for fishing, boating, and leisure. But beneath their waves lie foundations of homes, sidewalks, and memories. Whole communities, schools where children once learned to read, churches where vows were exchanged, general stores where neighbors greeted one another, were drowned in silence as dam projects transformed the landscape. Progress, as defined by those in power, demanded sacrifice. The sacrifice was entire towns, erased without ceremony. What binds these stories together is not just the tragedy of their endings, but the common thread of injustice. These weren't accidents of fate, they were the result of choices. State power declared some lands more useful as reservoirs or highways than as homes for families. Eminent domain was wielded as a tool that rarely favored those with the least protection. Racial hostility turned thriving neighborhoods into targets of destruction. Each act, whether through bureaucracy or violence, sent the same message: the survival of certain communities was not valued in the same way as others. And yet, to tell these stories is not to dwell only in grief. It is also to honor the people who built these towns in the first place. They were dreamers and doers, farmers and entrepreneurs, parents and children. Their lives were not defined solely by what was taken from them, but by what they achieved against extraordinary odds. The houses they raised, the businesses they founded, the schools they established, all of these were acts of defiance and vision. Even though the towns themselves may no longer stand, the legacy of those who created them continues to shape the present. When we remember these erased communities, we push back against the silence that sought to cover them. We restore names to the nameless, stories to the forgotten, and dignity to the displaced. A lake may have swallowed a neighborhood, but it cannot erase the laughter that once echoed there. A highway may cut through a former settlement, but it cannot undo the generations of resilience that built it. Even the ashes of burned towns carry within them the truth that such places once existed, vibrant and alive. These stories remind us that history is not only what is preserved, but also what is erased. They challenge us to ask whose lives are valued, whose memories are honored, and whose sacrifices are hidden beneath the surface of modern landscapes. They reveal that progress, when defined without justice, often comes at a cost too heavy to bear. The past cannot be changed, but it can be remembered. And in remembering, we can ensure that the communities once destroyed are not erased a second time, this time from our collective memory. Their stories live on, not only as warnings of what can be lost, but as testaments to what was built, cherished, and loved, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Across the landscape of America, there once stood towns filled with ambition, culture, and promise. They were not accidents of geography, but deliberate creations, built by people who longed for security, dignity, and a chance to thrive. Families planted roots, businesses opened their doors, schools prepared the next generation, and churches echoed with the sound of voices raised in song. These communities stood as living proof that determination and unity could carve out spaces of hope, even in times of deep hardship. And yet, many of these places no longer appear on maps. They were not forgotten because they failed. They did not vanish due to neglect or mismanagement. Instead, their erasure was the result of powerful forces, decisions made in distant offices, policies written on official paper, or violence unleashed in the dead of night. Some towns fell to eminent domain, their homes and streets claimed for projects deemed more valuable than the lives rooted there. Others were destroyed by coordinated attacks meant to drive families away, leaving ashes where prosperity once stood. Still more were drowned beneath man-made lakes, their histories swallowed by rising waters as dams were built in the name of progress. To walk through these stories is to hear echoes of resilience alongside the silence of loss. Imagine a thriving farming settlement, where neighbors gathered during harvest to celebrate the fruits of their labor. Within a generation, that same settlement was bulldozed, its land seized for a new highway that cut directly through its heart. Families received pennies on the dollar for homes that had taken decades to build. What had once been fields of crops and laughter became stretches of asphalt, carrying travelers who would never know what stood there before. Picture another town, this one rich with shops, theaters, and schools, an entire ecosystem of Black entrepreneurship and pride. For years, it thrived despite the barriers surrounding it. But success came with a cost. One night, fear and hatred descended, turning prosperity into rubble. Businesses burned, families fled, and the story of that town was deliberately buried. Its destruction was not a random act, it was a message, a way of asserting control through devastation. Then there are the towns that rest at the bottom of shimmering lakes. At first glance, these bodies of water appear serene, places for fishing, boating, and leisure. But beneath their waves lie foundations of homes, sidewalks, and memories. Whole communities, schools where children once learned to read, churches where vows were exchanged, general stores where neighbors greeted one another, were drowned in silence as dam projects transformed the landscape. Progress, as defined by those in power, demanded sacrifice. The sacrifice was entire towns, erased without ceremony. What binds these stories together is not just the tragedy of their endings, but the common thread of injustice. These weren't accidents of fate, they were the result of choices. State power declared some lands more useful as reservoirs or highways than as homes for families. Eminent domain was wielded as a tool that rarely favored those with the least protection. Racial hostility turned thriving neighborhoods into targets of destruction. Each act, whether through bureaucracy or violence, sent the same message: the survival of certain communities was not valued in the same way as others. And yet, to tell these stories is not to dwell only in grief. It is also to honor the people who built these towns in the first place. They were dreamers and doers, farmers and entrepreneurs, parents and children. Their lives were not defined solely by what was taken from them, but by what they achieved against extraordinary odds. The houses they raised, the businesses they founded, the schools they established, all of these were acts of defiance and vision. Even though the towns themselves may no longer stand, the legacy of those who created them continues to shape the present. When we remember these erased communities, we push back against the silence that sought to cover them. We restore names to the nameless, stories to the forgotten, and dignity to the displaced. A lake may have swallowed a neighborhood, but it cannot erase the laughter that once echoed there. A highway may cut through a former settlement, but it cannot undo the generations of resilience that built it. Even the ashes of burned towns carry within them the truth that such places once existed, vibrant and alive. These stories remind us that history is not only what is preserved, but also what is erased. They challenge us to ask whose lives are valued, whose memories are honored, and whose sacrifices are hidden beneath the surface of modern landscapes. They reveal that progress, when defined without justice, often comes at a cost too heavy to bear. The past cannot be changed, but it can be remembered. And in remembering, we can ensure that the communities once destroyed are not erased a second time, this time from our collective memory. Their stories live on, not only as warnings of what can be lost, but as testaments to what was built, cherished, and loved, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Across the United States, there are places where the past lingers like an echo. You won't find these towns on modern maps, nor will you stumble across their streets on a Sunday drive. Many of them lie beneath lakes, highways, or the weight of silence. But though the towns themselves may be gone, their stories are being carried forward, not by governments or institutions of power, but by the people whose families once called those communities home. Descendants and local historians have become the keepers of memory. They sift through old photographs, yellowed deeds, and whispered recollections passed down at family gatherings. In doing so, they bring life back to places that might otherwise be forgotten. Some gather annually at family reunions or festivals, transforming what could have been simple occasions into vibrant commemorations of the towns that once flourished. What looks like a celebration is, at its heart, an act of defiance against forgetting. Music fills the air, storytellers recount what life was like, and children learn that their heritage includes towns where their ancestors built schools, businesses, and homes with pride. Museums, too, are becoming sanctuaries of remembrance. Often founded by descendants themselves, these spaces hold artifacts rescued from attics and archives. A faded ledger from a general store. A photograph of a church choir. A diary detailing the rhythm of life in a farming community now long submerged. When displayed together, these fragments reconstruct an image of what was lost. Visitors can walk through an exhibit and sense not just the weight of history, but the heartbeat of a community that once thrived. Each artifact whispers, "We were here. We mattered. Remember us." The work of preservation is not just about looking back, it is also about reclaiming dignity in the present. For decades, many of these stories were left untold, dismissed as unimportant or inconvenient. By bringing them into public view, descendants challenge that erasure. Festivals that honor these towns draw visitors from across the country. Commemorative markers and plaques are erected where houses and schools once stood. Even if the original structures have disappeared, these signs make clear that the land carries memory. Standing before them, one cannot help but imagine the lives once lived there. In some cases, the preservation takes the form of oral history projects. Elders share memories of their childhoods in towns that no longer exist, their words recorded for future generations. These voices capture details no textbook could ever hold: the taste of summer fruit from a backyard tree, the sound of a mother calling children home at dusk, the pride of a community gathering on Sundays in their finest clothes. Through these recollections, the towns rise again, not in physical form, but in spirit. They remind us that history is not only dates and events, but lived experience, full of texture and humanity. What makes these acts of preservation even more powerful is the way they connect past to present. Young people, often unaware of this buried history, discover that their family names are linked to places of resilience and creativity. They inherit not only the loss, but also the strength of their ancestors. In learning about these erased towns, they gain a deeper understanding of who they are and the struggles that shape their present. The work of remembrance becomes a bridge across generations, ensuring that what was nearly forgotten becomes a source of pride and identity. Communities also use these stories to spark broader conversations. Festivals and commemorations become platforms to talk about resilience, justice, and the meaning of home. They remind us that progress should not come at the cost of erasing entire neighborhoods. They ask us to consider, what do we owe to those whose sacrifices built the roads, reservoirs, and cities we live in today? How can we honor their memory not just with words, but with action? In every museum exhibit, every festival stage, every commemorative marker, there is a deeper message. It is a reminder that history cannot be erased as long as someone is willing to tell it. These efforts show that memory is a living thing, kept alive by communities who refuse to let silence win. They demonstrate that even when physical structures are gone, the stories tied to them remain, waiting to be shared and honored. The descendants and historians who dedicate themselves to this work are not merely looking back, they are shaping the future. By preserving and sharing these stories, they are ensuring that the towns live on in the collective memory of the nation. In a world that often prioritizes speed and progress, they remind us to pause and listen to the echoes beneath the surface. These acts of remembrance are more than just history, they are resilience in motion. They are families gathering around campfires to tell the stories of what once was. They are festivals filled with laughter and music, carrying forward the spirit of communities that once thrived. They are museums where artifacts speak louder than silence. And most of all, they are a testament to the unbreakable will of people who understand that memory itself is a form of survival. Through these efforts, the erased towns are not truly gone. They live in stories, in celebrations, in the determination of descendants who refuse to let them disappear. And as long as these stories are told, the legacy of those communities remains unbroken, an enduring light against the shadows of forgetting. As the echoes of these forgotten towns rise from beneath lakes, from behind forests, and from the silence of abandoned land, they leave us with powerful lessons. Each story is not just about what was lost, it is about what was built in the first place. These were communities created with vision, determination, and pride. Schools were raised where there had once been none, businesses thrived against the odds, and families cultivated a sense of belonging in places where the wider world often denied them dignity. To remember these places is to honor not only the pain of their erasure but also the strength that made them possible. When we look closely, we see resilience shining through every story. Against a backdrop of enormous challenges, people carved out spaces of safety, industry, and culture. They planted crops in stubborn soil, taught children lessons that extended far beyond textbooks, and gathered on porches to share dreams for the future. Their resilience was not just about survival, it was about creating beauty and hope in a world that too often tried to strip those things away. Even though many of these communities were later destroyed, their spirit remains as a reminder that resilience is one of the most powerful legacies a people can leave behind. Yet their disappearance also speaks to a painful truth. Progress, when defined by power without compassion, often comes at a devastating cost. Highways were built, dams were raised, and land was claimed in the name of development. But behind those projects lay countless displaced families, uprooted lives, and erased histories. To acknowledge this cost is not about dwelling on the past, it is about recognizing the true weight of decisions that were made, and ensuring that in the future, communities are not sacrificed so easily. The lesson is clear: progress that demands erasure is not progress at all, but a loss for everyone. These stories also remind us of the importance of memory. History does not exist only in textbooks or monuments, it lives in the stories passed down by families, in the gatherings held by descendants, in the festivals and museums that keep these towns alive in spirit. To remember is to resist the silence that erasure demands. By telling and retelling these histories, we shine light on what was once hidden, and in doing so, we restore dignity to those who came before. Memory becomes a form of justice, a way of saying, you were here, you mattered, and you will not be forgotten. Justice, after all, begins with truth. By remembering these lost communities, we confront the systems that allowed their erasure and commit to building a future where such loss is not repeated. These stories are not relics of the past, they are guides for the present, urging us to value community, to protect heritage, and to honor the resilience of those who paved the way. If we listen closely, the echoes of these towns call us to act with more compassion, more awareness, and more responsibility. And so, as we close this journey through the forgotten chapters of history, let us carry these lessons with us. Let us see in these erased towns not only tragedy, but also inspiration. They remind us that even when communities are destroyed, their spirit can endure in memory, in story, and in the determination of those who refuse to let them vanish. To tell these stories is to keep them alive. If you found this story meaningful, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who may want to learn about these hidden histories. Together, we can ensure that these voices are never silenced again. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with light, memory, and hope.